Hey everyone, tonight we embark upon the most catastrophic and transformative conflict in galactic history, the Yuuzhan Vong invasion, a tale of an entire species driven from their home galaxy, wielding living ships and organic weapons invisible to the Force itself. Their conquest would reshape worlds, topple governments, and challenge everything the galaxy thought it knew about life, death, and the nature of existence. So before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy the stories I share here. I've noticed that about 85% of viewers who regularly watch these tales haven't subscribed yet, and your support truly helps this channel grow and bring you more epic galactic chronicles. Also, drop a comment below letting me know where in the galaxy you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the universe. There's something magical about knowing fellow travelers are joining this journey from across the world, perhaps under starlit skies or in the quiet hours before dawn. And if you're hungry for even more Star Wars lore and deep dives into the Galactic Chronicles, do visit my friend's channel, Loreverse. I've added the link in the description below. They craft incredible explorations of the galaxy far, far away that complement these sleep stories perfectly. Now dim the lights, settle into your blanket, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the ancient chronicles of the galaxy, it is written that darkness comes not always with the roar of conquest, but sometimes with the silence of the void. Listen now to fragments of a tale that would echo through the ages, whispered in the halls of the rebuilt Jedi Temple, recorded in the secret archives of the New Republic. There was a moment, 25 years after the Battle of Yavin, when the galaxy held its breath without knowing why. In that moment, a Jedi Knight named Miko Riglia stood upon the observation deck of a New Republic scout vessel, staring into the unknown regions beyond the galactic rim. The stars seemed different that night, colder somehow, as if something vast and hungry watched from the spaces between worlds. What Miko could not have known, what none in the galaxy could have foreseen, was that at that very moment, massive living ships were already crossing the void between galaxies. Ships that breathed and bled and hungered. Ships crewed by warriors who had carved the pain of entire worlds into their own flesh, who worshipped gods of agony and viewed the Force itself as the greatest blasphemy ever conceived. They came not as conquerors seeking glory, but as a species fleeing a darkness so terrible they had mutilated their own souls to escape it. They came seeking not just worlds to inhabit, but absolution for sins that stretched back across eons. And they brought with them a simple, terrifying truth that would shake the foundations of everything the galaxy believed about the nature of existence itself. But I get ahead of myself. Every legend must begin at its proper place. And this tale starts not with invasion, but with the deceptive peace that came before the storm. In those days, the galaxy knew a peace it had not tasted in generations. 25 years had passed since the fall of the Empire, and the New Republic flourished like a garden after long winter. The hyperspace lanes hummed with trade vessels carrying exotic goods from Coruscant to the Outer Rim. Children born in the shadow of the Death Star now raised families of their own, knowing war only through the stories of their elders. On Yavin 4, where ancient Massassi temples pierced the canopy like fingers reaching toward the stars, Luke Skywalker had built his Jedi Academy upon foundations both literal and metaphorical. The humid air carried the sounds of lightsaber practice and quiet meditation, the gentle hum of a new generation discovering their connection to the Force. Students from a dozen species walked the jungle paths, their minds opening to mysteries that had been suppressed for decades under Imperial rule. It was here, in the early morning hours, when Yavin's orange giant painted the temple stones in shades of amber and gold, that our tale truly begins. You walk these ancient corridors, not as a student, but as something rarer still, a Jedi historian, one of the few who had dedicated their lives to preserving the wisdom of ages past and watching for the shadows of threats yet to come. Your footsteps echo softly on stones that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations. In your hands, you carry a holocron of unusual design, its crystalline structure pulsing with an inner light that seems almost alive. Master Skywalker had entrusted you with its study, for within its geometric depths lay prophecies and warnings from Jedi long dead, speaking of dangers from beyond the known galaxy. The morning meditation chamber welcomes you with its familiar serenity. Shafts of golden sunlight filter through the crystal formations embedded in the temple walls, casting rainbow patterns that dance and shift as Yavin 4 continues its eternal rotation. Here, surrounded by the living presence of the Force as it flows through countless forms of jungle life, you begin your daily communion with the ancient voices preserved in the holocron. But today feels different. As you activate the device and its holographic chronicler materializes before you, a blue-tinged figure of a long-dead Jedi Master, you sense something that makes you pause. The Force itself seems to whisper warnings at the edge of perception, like distant thunder that precedes the storm. The jungle sounds seem muted, as if the very wildlife holds its breath in anticipation of something vast approaching. Master Skywalker enters the chamber with his characteristic quiet grace, his presence in the Force like a warm hearth in the growing chill you cannot quite explain. Beside him walks Mara Jade Skywalker, her former assassin's instincts now finely tuned to serve the light, her green eyes alert and searching. Both carry the weight of experience, the hard-earned wisdom of those who have faced darkness and emerged transformed. Luke's voice carries the gentle authority of one who has learned that the greatest strength often lies in restraint. As he settles into meditation posture beside you, he speaks of dreams that have troubled his sleep, visions of ships that seem to exist outside the Force's embrace, of worlds transformed beyond recognition by alien hands. Mara adds her own observations, reports from New Republic intelligence of disturbances in the unknown regions, scout ships that have simply vanished without trace or explanation. The holocron pulses brighter in response to their words, and the ancient Jedi Master's image speaks with growing urgency of prophecies recorded millennia ago. Prophecies that speak of children born outside the Force's light, of a species that would test the galaxy's understanding of life itself. The words seem to hang in the humid air like incense, heavy with meaning and warning. Yet for all these portents and whispered fears, none of you can imagine the true scope of what approaches. How could anyone conceive of an entire species that had willingly severed its connection to the Force? How could peaceful minds comprehend warriors who found divinity in pain and viewed biological technology as the only pure form of creation? The morning meditation continues, but somewhere beyond the galactic rim, living ships adjust their course toward a galaxy unprepared for their coming. The decision came not with fanfare or ceremony, but in the quiet moments between dawn and full daylight, when the ancient Jedi temple held its deepest silence. Master Skywalker stood before the great transperistyle viewport that overlooked the jungle canopy, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he contemplated the weight of responsibility that had defined his entire adult life. The Force flowed around him like a gentle current, carrying whispers of concern from across the galaxy. You felt it too, that subtle shift in the cosmic fabric that spoke of changes approaching like distant storm clouds. The holocron in your possession had grown increasingly agitated over the past weeks, its ancient chronicler appearing without summons to speak in urgent tones of preparations that must be made. The Jedi of old had faced many threats, but their recorded warnings spoke of something unprecedented, something that challenged the very foundations of what it meant to be alive in a galaxy touched by the Force. Reports from the unknown regions had grown more troubling with each passing day. Admiral Akbar's intelligence network, still formidable despite the Mon Calamari's advancing years, painted a picture of systematic disappearances that followed no pattern recognizable to military strategists. Entire scout fleets vanished without distress calls. Trading vessels that had plied those dangerous but profitable routes for decades simply failed to return. Most disturbing of all were the few survivors who did make it back, bearing tales so outlandish that even hardened New Republic officers dismissed them as stress-induced hallucinations. These refugees spoke of ships that seemed to be grown rather than built, vessels that pulsed with organic life and moved through space with an predatory grace that defied conventional understanding of physics. They described weapons that appeared to be living creatures and warriors whose bodies bore ritual scarification so extensive that they seemed more artwork than flesh. Most unsettling of all were the consistent reports that these beings existed in a void of silence within the Force, as if they occupied spaces where the binding energy of life itself simply ceased to exist. The Chiss Ascendancy, through their carefully maintained diplomatic channels, had begun sharing intelligence that painted an even more disturbing picture. Grand Admiral Thrawn's strategic analyses, recovered from Imperial archives, contained references to what he termed far outsiders, beings from beyond the galactic rim, whose very existence posed a fundamental threat to the established order. Thrawn's tactical genius had recognized patterns in ancient conflicts that suggested periodic incursions from extragalactic sources, invasions that corresponded with dark periods in galactic history, when entire civilizations simply vanished from the historical record. Commander Vos Park, now elderly but still sharp, had maintained Thrawn's research projects in the unknown regions long after the Grand Admiral's death. His reports to Luke spoke of Chiss border patrols encountering probe vessels of unknown design, craft that employed biotechnology far in advance of anything in the galactic database. More troubling still were the Chiss reports of dead zones appearing in space itself, regions where their Force-sensitive navigators experienced complete sensory blackout, as if traveling through areas where the cosmic energy that bound the galaxy together had been somehow severed or consumed. The Exgal Society, those dedicated scientists who had spent their careers studying phenomena beyond the galactic rim, had detected gravitational anomalies that suggested massive objects moving through intergalactic space at velocities that should have been impossible for anything larger than a starfighter. Yomin Kar's research station on Belkadan had gone silent 3 months earlier, its final transmission speaking of biological agents that appeared to be terraforming the planet's ecosystem at an unprecedented rate. The transformation described in those last desperate communications defied everything known about planetary engineering, suggesting a level of biological manipulation that bordered on the miraculous. Mara Jade brought her own perspective to these growing concerns, her years as the Emperor's hand having taught her to recognize patterns of infiltration and preparation that escaped conventional intelligence analysis. She had begun identifying subtle signs of advanced reconnaissance throughout the galaxy, evidence of long-term observation and planning that suggested whoever was coming had been studying galactic civilization for decades. Financial irregularities on dozens of worlds pointed to the establishment of sleeper networks. Political movements that had emerged seemingly from nowhere began advocating policies that would weaken planetary defense systems and create refugee populations ripe for exploitation. The New Republic Senate, caught between competing demands for resources and the natural tendency of democratic institutions to move slowly, struggled to comprehend a threat that existed largely in intelligence reports and strategic projections. Senator Leia Organa Solo, her diplomatic skills honed by years of navigating political complexities, found herself fighting an uphill battle to secure funding for enhanced border patrol operations and early warning systems. The senators from core worlds, comfortable in their prosperity and protected by layers of defensive fleets, saw little reason to divert resources toward threats that might never materialize. Chief of State Borsk Felia, the Bothan politician whose calculating nature had served him well in peacetime governance, viewed the growing reports with the skepticism of one who had seen too many false alarms and manufactured crises. His intelligence network, focused primarily on internal political maneuvering and economic stability, was ill-equipped to analyze threats that operated outside conventional parameters. The Bothan's legendary information-gathering capabilities, so effective within the known galaxy, found themselves strangely limited when directed toward the unknown regions. Yet despite bureaucratic inertia and political skepticism, preparations began in earnest among those who understood the gravity of the approaching storm. Luke authorized the establishment of advanced training programs at the Jedi Academy, courses designed to help Force-sensitive individuals develop their abilities to perceive and combat threats that existed outside normal sensory parameters. Ancient techniques, recovered from holocrons and forgotten archives, were studied and adapted for modern application. The Mon Calamari shipyards, those legendary facilities that had produced the cruisers which won the Galactic Civil War, began subtle modifications to their construction programs. Admiral Akbar, consulting with New Republic Fleet Command, initiated design studies for vessels that could operate independently for extended periods in regions where conventional support networks might not exist. The organic curves of Mon Calamari naval architecture, born from their species' natural affinity for biological forms, would prove more prescient than anyone could have imagined. Corellian Engineering Corporation, under Han Solo's informal influence, began developing modifications to their existing starship designs that would allow for greater adaptability and self-sufficiency. Han's smuggling background had taught him the value of vessels that could operate outside established infrastructure, and he quietly pushed for innovations that would serve the galaxy well in the conflicts to come. His modifications focused on enhanced shielding systems and improved sensor arrays, technologies that would prove crucial in detecting and defending against enemies that conventional scanners might miss entirely. As these preparations unfolded across the galaxy, you found yourself at the center of an information-gathering effort, unlike anything attempted since the formation of the Rebel Alliance. Your role as a Jedi historian provided access to archives and records that spanned millennia of galactic civilization. Ancient Sith texts, recovered from forbidden temples and hidden vaults, contained references to extragalactic threats that had been dismissed as mythology by previous scholars. Jedi chronicles spoke of periods when the Force itself seemed diminished, as if vast portions of the galaxy had been somehow cut away from the cosmic energy that sustained all life. The weight of this knowledge settled upon your shoulders like a heavy cloak. Every morning brought new reports, new evidence that something unprecedented was approaching the galaxy. Yet for all the preparation and analysis, for all the intelligence gathering and strategic planning, none could have predicted the true nature of what was coming. How could beings who had lived their entire lives connected to the Force comprehend a species that had deliberately severed that connection? How could a galaxy that viewed technology and biology as complementary forces understand warriors who saw them as fundamentally opposed? The journey into darkness had begun, though none yet realized how far that path would lead, or what transformations awaited at its end. The first concrete evidence arrived, not through military channels or intelligence networks, but in the trembling voice of a freighter captain named Danny Kui, whose scientific background made her observations impossible to dismiss as spacer folklore. Her modified light freighter, equipped with sensitive astronomical instruments for her work with the Exgal Society, had been conducting routine observations near the galactic rim when her sensors detected something that challenged everything she thought she understood about space travel and alien technology. The object appeared on her long-range scanners as a gravitational anomaly of staggering proportions, something roughly spherical and approximately 60 kilometers in diameter, moving through space at velocities that conventional physics suggested should tear any structure apart. As Dani's instruments focused on the approaching mass, the readings defied rational explanation. The object appeared to be generating its own gravitational field, warping space around itself in ways that suggested either impossibly advanced technology or something that operated according to entirely different natural laws. What made her report truly disturbing was not just the size and impossible speed of the object, but its composition. Every scan she attempted returned data, suggesting that the massive structure was somehow alive. Thermal imaging revealed patterns consistent with biological heat distribution. Electromagnetic readings showed fluctuations that resembled neural activity on a cosmic scale. Most impossibly, the object appeared to be breathing, expanding and contracting in regular rhythms that suggested respiration on a scale that boggled the mind. The Excal Society's research station on Belkadan had been monitoring similar phenomena for months before Dr. Yuuzhan Vong's final transmissions painted a picture of biological transformation that seemed torn from the worst fever dreams of terraforming engineers. The planet's ecosystem was being systematically altered by microscopic organisms that appeared to have been deliberately introduced to the world's biosphere. These organisms, unlike anything in the galactic taxonomic databases, worked with terrifying efficiency to break down existing life forms and reconstruct them according to some alien template. Dr. Carr's scientific training allowed him to document the transformation process with clinical precision, even as his world died around him. The alien microorganisms didn't simply destroy existing life, they incorporated it into new forms that served purposes he could barely comprehend. Forests became living factories that produced organic compounds unknown to galactic chemistry. Oceans transformed into breeding pools for creatures that existed somewhere between plant and animal classification. The very atmosphere began changing composition, becoming thick with spores and biological agents that made breathing increasingly difficult for native species. His final transmission, broadcast on emergency frequencies as his research station's life support systems began failing, spoke of witnessing the birth of something that challenged his understanding of what constituted life itself. The planet was becoming a single vast organism, its continents functioning as organs in some incomprehensible biological system. Mountains moved like breathing lungs. Rivers flowed with purpose rather than gravity. The transformation was so complete and so rapid that he suspected the alien organisms possessed knowledge of biological engineering that surpassed anything achieved by the most advanced civilizations in galactic history. When New Republic scout teams finally reached Belkadan's coordinates, they found a world that bore no resemblance to the temperate research station documented in their navigation databases. The planet's surface writhed with alien vegetation that seemed to pulse with malevolent intelligence. Atmospheric readings showed chemical compositions toxic to most known life forms. Most disturbing of all were the massive organic structures that dotted the landscape like tumors, constructions that served purposes the reconnaissance teams couldn't begin to guess at. The scout team's attempts to establish landing protocols revealed another troubling aspect of whatever force was transforming worlds throughout the unknown regions. Their ship's sensors, carefully calibrated to detect force signatures and energy patterns, returned readings that made no sense. The planet below existed in what could only be described as a void within the force, a region where the binding energy that connected all living things simply ceased to register. It was as if someone had taken a knife to the fabric of reality and carved out sections where the fundamental laws of the galaxy no longer applied. Jedi Knight Miko Ruglia, assigned to one of the reconnaissance missions, described the experience as similar to sudden deafness or blindness, a complete absence of the sensory information that force-sensitive individuals relied upon to navigate the galaxy. Standing on the bridge of the scout vessel in orbit around the transformed world, she found herself unable to sense the life energy that should have emanated from a planet teeming with biological activity. The void was so complete that she began questioning whether her own connection to the Force had been somehow severed. These findings prompted emergency sessions at the Jedi Academy, gatherings where masters and students alike struggled to comprehend phenomena that challenged their most basic assumptions about the nature of existence. Master Skywalker, consulting archives that reached back to the earliest days of the Jedi Order, found references to similar voids in ancient texts that spoke of the far outsiders and their ability to exist in spaces where the Force held no dominion. These references, previously dismissed as allegorical or metaphorical, began taking on new and terrifying significance. Jacen Solo, always the most philosophically inclined of the young Jedi, spent long hours in meditation, attempting to understand how life could exist without connection to the binding energy that sustained the galaxy. His empathic abilities, normally so sensitive to the emotional states of living beings, returned nothing but silence when directed toward the biological samples recovered from the transformed worlds. It was as if he was trying to communicate with elaborate mechanical constructions rather than living organisms, despite overwhelming evidence that these creatures possessed all the characteristics of biological life. The implications began spreading through the scientific community like ripples in a pond. If life could exist completely severed from the Force, then everything the galaxy understood about consciousness, intelligence, and the nature of existence itself required fundamental re-examination. Biologists struggled to explain how complex organisms could function without the subtle energy fields that seemed to guide cellular development and organism behavior. Philosophers debated whether beings existing outside the Force could be considered truly alive in any meaningful sense. Meanwhile, intelligence networks throughout the galaxy began connecting dots that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of long-term infiltration and preparation. Financial records revealed patterns of economic manipulation stretching back decades, subtle influences that had shaped planetary development and resource allocation in ways that only made sense if viewed as preparation for invasion. Political movements that had emerged seemingly from nowhere now appeared to be the result of careful cultivation by agents working toward goals that transcended normal understanding of conquest and occupation. Nomenor, a name that appeared in connection with various religious and political movements across multiple worlds, began emerging as a person of interest in New Republic intelligence files. His background proved remarkably difficult to verify, as if his entire identity had been carefully constructed to withstand casual investigation. What intelligence analysts could determine painted a picture of someone with access to resources and information networks that suggested backing by forces far more sophisticated than typical criminal organizations or political movements. The Yuuzhan Vong advance agents, though none yet knew to call them by that name, had spent years establishing the infrastructure necessary to support a full-scale invasion. They had studied galactic civilization with the patience of a species that measured time in geological epochs rather than political cycles. Every weakness in the New Republic's defensive posture had been catalogued and analyzed. Every cultural division that could be exploited for strategic advantage had been identified and quietly encouraged. Religious movements preaching the superiority of biological systems over mechanical technology gained adherents on dozens of worlds. Political parties advocating for reduced military spending and increased focus on internal development found themselves receiving anonymous financial support. Scientists researching biological adaptation and genetic modification discovered that their work was being quietly monitored and their findings somehow finding their way into databases that shouldn't have existed. As these revelations accumulated, the galaxy found itself facing a crisis of understanding that went far beyond military preparedness. The very concepts that defined civilization, life, and consciousness were being challenged by evidence of beings who existed according to entirely different rules. The comfortable assumptions that had guided galactic society for millennia suddenly seemed naive and inadequate in the face of a threat that operated outside every known parameter of existence. The reconnaissance missions continued, each one bringing back evidence of transformations that defied explanation and technologies that challenged comprehension. Yet for all the data gathered and analyzed, for all the intelligence compiled and strategic assessments prepared, the galaxy remained fundamentally unprepared for what was approaching from the void between galaxies. In the gleaming conference chambers of the New Republic Senate, where representatives from thousands of worlds gathered to shape galactic policy, the mounting evidence of an external threat was filtered through the comfortable lens of familiar experience. Senator after senator rose to speak of historical precedents, drawing parallels to the imperial invasion of Ryloth or the separatist occupation of Geonosis. The reports of biological transformation and force voids were acknowledged, but interpreted through frameworks that made sense to minds shaped by centuries of conventional warfare. Admiral Gilad Pellaeon, his imperial training now serving the new republic with the same dedication he had once shown to the empire, presented strategic analyses that painted the approaching threat in terms that military planners could understand and counter. His assessment, delivered with the crisp efficiency that had made him one of the galaxy's most respected naval commanders, concluded that the enemy employed advanced biotechnology as a psychological weapon, designed to demoralize defenders through its alien appearance and unfamiliar capabilities. The biological ships, according to Pellaeon's analysis, were simply an alternative approach to spacecraft design. No more inherently superior to conventional vessels than organic computing was to standard processors. Their apparent immunity to force detection could be explained through sophisticated shielding technology that disrupted normal sensor readings. The transformation of worlds like Belkaden was merely an extreme form of terraforming, employing biological agents instead of mechanical systems to achieve environmental modification. This interpretation brought visible relief to the assembled senators and military commanders. If the threat could be understood in conventional terms, then it could be countered using conventional methods. The new republic's substantial fleet assets, honed through years of conflict with imperial remnants and criminal organizations, should prove more than adequate to repel invaders who relied primarily on biological systems. After all, living tissue, however cleverly engineered, remained vulnerable to turbolaser fire and proton torpedoes. Chief of State Borsk Failure, his political instincts attuned to the mood of the Senate, seized upon this comfortable conclusion with obvious satisfaction. The Bothan leader's speech, delivered with the rhetorical flourish that had served him well throughout his political career, dismissed the more exotic aspects of the intelligence reports as the natural tendency of beings to exaggerate threats they didn't fully understand. He drew historical parallels to the early reports of Death Star capabilities, which had initially been dismissed as impossible, and suggested that fear was leading to overestimation of enemy capabilities. The Senate approved increased funding for border patrol operations and authorized the deployment of additional fleet assets to the unknown regions. But these measures were structured as responses to a conventional invasion threat rather than preparations for something unprecedented. The military preparations followed established protocols for defending against hostile species, with emphasis on superior firepower and technological advantages that had served the galaxy well in previous conflicts. General Wedge Antilles, commanding Rogue Squadron and serving as a tactical advisor to Fleet Command, found himself implementing defensive strategies that felt uncomfortably familiar. The fighter screen deployments, the capital ship positioning, even the intelligence gathering operations followed patterns that had been refined through decades of warfare against enemies who operated according to understood principles. His tactical genius recognized the elegant simplicity of the preparations, but some instinct warned him that elegance might prove inadequate against an enemy that operated outside conventional parameters. The Jedi Council, meeting in emergency session at the Academy on Yavin 4, struggled with their own version of this comfortable misunderstanding. Master Skywalker, consulting with other Force-sensitive individuals throughout the galaxy, found himself drawn toward interpretations that preserved the fundamental assumptions about life and consciousness that had guided Jedi philosophy for millennia. Perhaps the Force voids reported by reconnaissance teams were temporary phenomena, disruptions that would fade as the galaxy's binding energy reasserted itself. Perhaps the apparent immunity of enemy forces to force detection was simply a matter of learning to perceive them through different methods. Jacen Solo, his philosophical nature leading him to question these convenient conclusions, spent increasing amounts of time in meditation, attempting to extend his consciousness toward the regions where the void had been reported. His efforts met with complete failure, as if he was trying to perceive something through senses that had been deliberately severed. Yet rather than accepting this failure as evidence of something unprecedented, he found himself wondering whether his own abilities had been somehow compromised or whether fear was interfering with his normal force sensitivity. The comfortable conclusion extended beyond military and political leadership to encompass the general population of the galaxy. HoloNet broadcasts, carefully edited to avoid causing panic, presented the emerging threat as a manageable challenge that would be resolved through the same combination of military competence and diplomatic skill that had ended the galactic civil war. Citizens across thousands of worlds continued their daily lives with only mild concern for events unfolding at the galactic rim, secure in the knowledge that their governments and military forces remained capable of protecting them from external threats. Trade continued flowing along established hyperspace routes, though insurance rates for cargo vessels traveling near the unknown regions increased substantially. Financial markets showed minor fluctuations in response to increased military spending, but nothing approaching the economic disruption that would accompany genuine fear of systemic threat. The comfortable rhythms of galactic civilization continued essentially unchanged, as if the approaching storm was merely another weather pattern to be endured rather than survived. On Coruscant, in the depths of the Jedi archives, a few scholars began voicing quiet doubts about the prevailing interpretation of events. Ancient texts, many written in languages that required careful translation, contained warnings that seemed to speak directly to current circumstances. References to species that had cut themselves away from the Force appeared with troubling frequency in prophecies and historical accounts that spanned multiple civilizations. These scholars found themselves increasingly isolated as their colleagues dismissed their concerns as academic overthinking of practical military challenges. Mara Jade, her experience as the Emperor's Hand having taught her to recognize the difference between genuine threats and manufactured crises, felt growing unease despite her husband's reassurances. Her instincts, honed through years of operating in hostile environments, detected patterns in the available intelligence that suggested preparation and infiltration on a scale that exceeded conventional understanding of military planning. The enemy's advance work showed patience and thoroughness that implied goals far more comprehensive than simple territorial conquest. Yet even Mara found herself drawn toward interpretations that made sense within established frameworks of understanding. The biological technology could be countered through adaptation of existing weapons systems. The Force immunity could be overcome through development of alternative detection methods. The systematic transformation of worlds could be reversed through application of sufficient scientific resources and terraforming expertise. This false sense of security extended throughout the galaxy's leadership structures, from military academies, where cadets studied conventional tactical responses, to diplomatic corps offices, where negotiators prepared for eventual peace talks with an enemy assumed to be operating from recognizable political motivations. The institutional frameworks that had served galactic civilization so well throughout its history were being mobilized to address a threat that operated according to completely different principles. The preparations continued, massive in scope but fundamentally misdirected. Fleets assembled to fight conventional battles against enemies who viewed conventional warfare as an amusing diversion. Weapons were manufactured to destroy targets that could adapt and evolve in real time. Diplomatic protocols were established for negotiating with beings who viewed negotiation itself as a form of weakness worthy of contempt. As these preparations reached their crescendo, scattered throughout the unknown regions, massive living ships continued their patient approach toward a galaxy that had convinced itself it understood what was coming. The first false conclusion would soon give way to terrible reality, but for now, the comfortable illusion of preparedness provided shelter against the approaching storm. The first true encounter with Yuuzhan Vong military might came not through planned engagement but through the terrifying discovery of what would later be known as a world ship, The massive biological construct drifting through space near the ice world of Helska 4 defied every conventional understanding of spacecraft engineering and challenged the fundamental assumptions about what constituted technology itself. When New Republic reconnaissance vessels approached the enormous organism, their sensors registered readings that seemed to originate from multiple overlapping sources, as if they were attempting to analyze an entire ecosystem rather than a single constructed object. Admiral Tracy Creasy, commanding the reconnaissance fleet from his flagship, watched in growing amazement as his tactical displays struggled to process information that made no sense according to standard military parameters. The object measured over 100 kilometers in diameter, its surface writhing with what appeared to be living coral formations that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns suggesting neural activity on a cosmic scale. Weapon emplacements, if they could be called that, consisted of creature-like protrusions that tracked the approaching New Republic vessels with predatory awareness. The worldship's escort craft presented an equally disturbing revelation about enemy capabilities. These vessels, later designated as coral skippers by Republic intelligence, moved through space with organic fluidity that suggested they were piloted rather than programmed. Their hulls appeared to be constructed from the same coral-like substance as the larger vessel, but analysis revealed that each fighter was actually a living entity capable of independent thought and adaptation. When Republic starfighters attempted to engage them in conventional combat, the alien craft demonstrated abilities that challenged every tactical manual in existence. The coral skippers possessed the ability to manipulate gravitic fields in ways that allowed them to accelerate and maneuver without regard for the physical limitations that constrained conventional spacecraft. They could generate localized gravity wells to deflect incoming projectiles, essentially creating defensive fields that rendered traditional weapons ineffective. More disturbing still was their capacity to adapt in real time to enemy tactics, learning from each engagement and modifying their responses accordingly. Squadron leader Gavin Darklighter, leading his X-Wing pilots in the first systematic engagement with these alien fighters, found himself facing opponents that seemed to anticipate his tactical decisions before he made them. The enemy craft didn't simply evade incoming fire. They appeared to predict the flight paths of laser bolts and proton torpedoes, positioning themselves in locations that would have been impossible to calculate using conventional targeting systems. His after-action reports described the unsettling experience of fighting enemies that seemed to exist partially outside normal space-time, flickering in and out of sensor lock as if they could selectively interact with reality itself. The worldship's interior, revealed through probe droid reconnaissance and eventually limited ground exploration, presented an environment that challenged every preconception about spacecraft design and habitation. Rather than constructed corridors and chambers, the massive vessel contained what could only be described as a complete ecosystem, with different regions serving specialized functions within the larger organism. Forests of coral-like structures provided atmospheric processing and structural support. Vast chambers filled with bioluminescent organisms served as power generation centers. Entire districts housed warrior castes in environments that resembled underground cave systems more than traditional military quarters. The cultural implications of what the reconnaissance teams discovered proved even more disturbing than the technological revelations. The Yuuzhan Vong, as intelligence analysts eventually learned to call them, had created a society that was simultaneously primitive and advanced beyond galactic understanding. Their mastery of biological engineering surpassed anything achieved by the most sophisticated civilizations in known space, yet they appeared to view mechanical technology with religious revulsion that bordered on psychotic hatred. Captured artifacts revealed a species that had deliberately rejected everything the galaxy considered fundamental to technological advancement. No metal construction, no electronic systems, no artificial intelligences or computer networks existed anywhere within their civilization. Instead, they had developed biological alternatives that performed the same functions through organic processes that seemed to blur the line between technology and living tissue. Their weapons were creatures bred specifically for combat. Their tools were organisms modified to perform specialized tasks. Even their clothing and personal equipment consisted of living entities that formed symbiotic relationships with their users. The religious dimensions of Yuuzhan Vong culture proved particularly difficult for galactic analysts to comprehend. Intelligence gathered from captured equipment and intercepted communications revealed a complex pantheon of deities who demanded constant sacrifice and ritual scarification from their worshippers. Pain was not merely endured but actively sought as a form of religious communion. The extensive scarification that covered every Yuuzhan Vong body told stories of spiritual achievement and social status that required complete reinterpretation of how sentient species could relate to physical suffering. Supreme Commander Naz Choka, whose tactical genius would later prove instrumental in Yuuzhan Vong victories throughout the galaxy, embodied the warrior culture that had emerged from this fusion of biological mastery and religious fanaticism. His command decisions, analyzed through recovered battle recordings, revealed strategic thinking that operated according to principles completely foreign to galactic military tradition. Victory was measured not simply in terms of territorial gain or enemy casualties, but in the spiritual satisfaction derived from overcoming worthy opponents through superior pain tolerance and religious dedication. The implications for galactic defense became increasingly clear as intelligence analysts attempted to develop countermeasures against an enemy that operated outside every established parameter of warfare. Traditional electronic warfare techniques proved useless against biological systems that had no electronic components to disrupt. Conventional weapons, while capable of damaging living tissue, faced the challenge of targets that could adapt and heal in real time. Most problematic of all was the growing realization that the enemy's immunity to force detection wasn't a temporary phenomenon or technological achievement, but rather a fundamental characteristic of their very existence. Jedi Knights assigned to reconnaissance missions reported experiences that challenged their understanding of life itself. Master Kyle Katarn, his abilities refined through years of studying both light and dark aspects of the Force, found himself unable to sense the presence of Yuuzhan Vong warriors, even when they stood directly in front of him. The void they created in the Force wasn't simply an absence of the usual sensory information, but rather a positive darkness that seemed to actively repel attempts at Force-based perception. Jacen Solo, his philosophical nature driving him to seek understanding of phenomena that defied conventional explanation, spent considerable time attempting to comprehend how consciousness could exist without connection to the binding energy that sustained all known life. His meditation sessions, extended over days and weeks, brought him no closer to understanding beings who seemed to exist in a parallel dimension of experience that overlapped with normal reality only in purely physical interactions. The ecological impact of Yuuzhan Vong presence became apparent as more worlds fell under their influence. Unlike conventional conquerors who imposed new political systems while leaving basic planetary infrastructure intact, the Yuuzhan Vong systematically transformed entire biospheres to support their organic technology and religious requirements. Planets that had supported diverse ecosystems for millions of years were converted into single-purpose environments designed to produce specific biological materials or serve particular functions within the larger invasion plan. The transformation process itself revealed the true scope of their biological mastery. Rather than destroying existing life forms and replacing them with imported species, the Yuuzhan Vong employed sophisticated genetic manipulation to convert native organisms into forms that served their purposes. Forests became living factories. Oceans were converted into breeding pools for war creatures. Even the atmospheric composition of conquered worlds was gradually altered to better support Yuuzhan Vong physiology and technology. These discoveries forced military planners throughout the galaxy to confront the possibility that they were facing not simply another invasion, but rather a complete replacement of galactic civilization by something fundamentally alien. The comfortable assumptions that had guided strategic thinking for millennia proved inadequate when applied to enemies who viewed the physical universe through completely different conceptual frameworks. Research facilities on Coruscant and Kuat worked frantically to develop new approaches to combating biological technology, but their efforts were hampered by the realization that they were attempting to understand and counter systems that had evolved over millions of years of refinement. The Yuuzhan Vong biotechnology wasn't simply an alternative approach to conventional engineering, but rather the culmination of an entirely different path of technological development that had reached levels of sophistication that mechanical systems had never achieved. As reconnaissance reports accumulated and intelligence analyses painted an increasingly disturbing picture of enemy capabilities, the galaxy began to understand that the comfortable conclusions reached earlier had been catastrophically inadequate. The approaching storm was not another conventional war that could be won through superior firepower and tactical brilliance, but rather a collision between fundamentally incompatible forms of existence that would require unprecedented adaptation and sacrifice to survive. The catastrophe at Cernpedal shattered forever the galaxy's illusions about the nature of the threat they faced. What began as a routine evacuation of a mining world became a demonstration of power so profound that it redefined everyone's understanding of what constituted possible warfare. The Yuuzhan Vong had somehow seized control of Dobedo Cernpedal's moon and were systematically altering its orbit to bring it crashing into the planet below. The physics involved in such manipulation boggled the minds of the galaxy's greatest scientists, while the casual cruelty of destroying an entire world to eliminate a relatively small population revealed the enemy's complete disregard for concepts of proportional response. Han Solo stood on the bridge of the Millennium Falcon, watching through the cockpit viewport as Dobedo grew larger in Cernpedal's sky with each passing hour. The gravitational stresses were already tearing the planet apart, generating massive earthquakes and tidal disturbances that made evacuation efforts increasingly desperate. Refugee ships loaded with terrified civilians launched from every available spaceport, but the mathematics were inexorable. Too many people, too little time, too few ships to carry them all to safety before the moon completed its programmed descent. The revelation of Yuuzhan Vong infiltration capabilities came through the discovery of Nom Anar's true identity and the scope of his operations throughout the galaxy. For years, this master spy had operated under multiple identities, establishing religious movements, political organizations, and scientific research projects that served the invasion's long-term strategic objectives. His network of agents and sympathizers stretched across hundreds of worlds, each one carefully positioned to maximize chaos and minimize effective resistance when the invasion began in earnest. Nom Anna himself embodied the sophisticated biological mastery that made Yuuzhan Vong infiltration so effective. His ability to alter his physical appearance through symbiotic organisms allowed him to assume identities that could withstand careful scrutiny by intelligence agencies. Advanced bioimplants provided him with communication capabilities that operated outside conventional detection methods. Most remarkably, his preparation had included detailed study of galactic cultures and political systems that enabled him to manipulate existing social tensions with surgical precision. The religious movement he established on Ramamul exemplified his strategic genius. By exploiting existing resentment between the planet's population and their more prosperous neighbors, he created a fanatical following that viewed technological civilization as inherently corrupting and evil. His sermons, delivered with the passionate intensity of a true believer, preached the superiority of natural living over artificial enhancement. The irony that his own existence depended on sophisticated biotechnology was lost on followers who saw only a charismatic leader offering simple solutions to complex problems. The political ramifications of these discoveries sent shockwaves through New Republic leadership structures. Senator Leia Organa Solo, her diplomatic experience providing her with keen insight into manipulation techniques, recognized patterns of influence that extended far beyond single-planet operations. Financial records revealed funding streams that connected seemingly unrelated political movements across dozens of systems. Cultural exchanges that had been celebrated as examples of interspecies cooperation were revealed to be vehicles for intelligence gathering and agent placement. Chief of State Borsk Filia, confronted with evidence that his administration had been systematically compromised for years, struggled to maintain political stability while implementing security measures that threatened to undermine the democratic principles the new republic was founded upon. The Bothan leader's legendary paranoia, previously viewed as a political liability, suddenly appeared prescient as investigations revealed the extent to which enemy agents had penetrated every level of government and military command. The true scope of Yuuzhan Vong preparation became apparent as intelligence agencies across the galaxy began connecting previously isolated incidents and anomalies. Industrial accidents that had disrupted weapons production on key manufacturing worlds were revealed to be sabotage operations. Scientists researching advanced defensive technologies had found their work mysteriously delayed by bureaucratic obstacles and equipment failures. Military exercises designed to test new tactical doctrines had been compromised by intelligence leaks that allowed enemy observers to study Republic capabilities and identify weaknesses. Admiral Akbar, his strategic mind still sharp despite advancing age, recognized the implications of such comprehensive preparation. The enemy had been studying galactic civilization for decades, possibly centuries, learning not just military capabilities, but cultural vulnerabilities that could be exploited to maximize psychological impact. Their attack patterns weren't simply designed to conquer territory, but to destroy the social cohesion that held the new republic together. The biological weapons employed at Cernpidal represented a new category of strategic threat that challenged every assumption about acceptable warfare. The Dorvan basils, living creatures capable of generating and manipulating gravitic fields, possessed the ability to affect entire planetary systems. Their deployment against Cernpidal's moon demonstrated a level of power that rendered traditional concepts of military defense obsolete. If the enemy could move celestial bodies at will, then no world in the galaxy was truly safe from their reach. The evacuation efforts revealed both the heroism and limitations of galactic civilization when confronted with unprecedented crisis. Thousands of beings from dozens of species worked frantically to save as many lives as possible, demonstrating the cooperative spirit that had built the new republic. Yet the logistical challenges of evacuating an entire world's population in a matter of hours or days exceeded the capabilities of even the galaxy's most efficient transportation networks. Chewbacca's sacrifice, his final act of heroism in helping to save Anakin Solo while the moon crushed everything around them, became a symbol of both individual courage and the terrible cost of underestimating the enemy. The Wookiee's death sent shockwaves throughout the galaxy, not simply because of personal loss felt by his friends and allies, but because it demonstrated that even the strongest and most resourceful beings could be overwhelmed by forces beyond their control. Han Solo's grief, compounded by guilt over decisions made during the evacuation, reflected the broader trauma experienced by galactic civilization as it confronted the reality of fighting enemies who operated according to completely different moral frameworks. The comfortable assumptions about honor in combat, protection of civilians, and proportional response that had governed warfare for generations proved meaningless when applied to opponents who viewed such concepts as evidence of weakness and spiritual corruption. The strategic implications of Cernpidal's destruction extended far beyond the immediate loss of life and resources. The demonstration that entire worlds could be eliminated through gravitational manipulation created panic throughout the galaxy, as populations realized that conventional defensive preparations offered no protection against such attacks. Planetary shields and surface-based weapons systems became irrelevant when the threat came from redirected celestial bodies moving with the inexorable force of orbital mechanics. Intelligence analysts working frantically to understand enemy capabilities discovered that the Dovin basal creatures represented just one example of Yuuzhan Vong biotechnology that challenged conventional understanding of what living organisms could accomplish. These beings had somehow evolved or been engineered to interface directly with gravitational fields, manipulating fundamental forces of physics through biological processes that conventional science couldn't explain. The religious dimensions of Yuuzhan Vong's strategy became increasingly apparent as intelligence agencies analyzed recovered communications and captured equipment. Their conquest wasn't simply driven by resource acquisition or territorial expansion, but by genuine belief that they were conducting a holy war against technological corruption. Their willingness to destroy entire worlds wasn't evidence of callous disregard for life, but rather demonstration of their commitment to purifying the galaxy through elimination of what they viewed as spiritual contamination. Supreme Commander Nance Choka's tactical decisions, studied through analysis of battle recordings and refugee testimonies, revealed strategic thinking that prioritized psychological impact over efficient military conquest. The destruction of Cern Padal served multiple purposes beyond eliminating a single world's population. It demonstrated enemy capabilities to any who might consider resistance. It created refugee populations that would strain Republic resources and social cohesion. Most importantly, it established the Yuuzhan Vong as opponents who couldn't be deterred by conventional diplomatic or military responses. The discovery of advanced invasion fleets already positioned throughout the galaxy shattered any remaining hope that the threat could be contained through border defense operations. Reconnaissance vessels disguised as asteroids or derelict spacecraft had been gathering intelligence and establishing supply caches for years before the main invasion began. Sleeper agents embedded within Republic military and civilian structures provided real-time intelligence that made surprise attacks and strategic deception nearly impossible to achieve. As reports accumulated from across the galactic rim, a pattern emerged that revealed the true scope of what the galaxy faced. This wasn't an invasion in any conventional sense, but rather the opening phase of a complete transformation of galactic civilization. The Yuuzhan Vong hadn't come to conquer existing systems and impose new management. They had come to replace everything that defined technological society with biological alternatives that served their religious and cultural requirements. The comfortable world of the New Republic, built on assumptions about technological progress and diplomatic solutions, was ending. In its place came a struggle for survival that would test every assumption about what it meant to be alive in a galaxy connected by the Force, threatened by beings who existed outside its embrace. Deep within the archives of the Jedi Temple, in chambers that few living beings had ever entered, ancient holocrons began revealing secrets that challenged everything the galaxy thought it understood about the nature of existence itself. The mechanical voices of long-dead Jedi Masters spoke in urgent whispers about prophecies that had been dismissed as metaphorical warnings, descriptions of a species that had deliberately severed its connection to the Force through acts of self-mutilation, so profound that they defied comprehension. The truth about the Yuuzhan Vong's origins emerged not through conventional intelligence gathering, but through painstaking archaeological research and the analysis of artifacts that predated recorded galactic history. Master Luke Skywalker, working alongside the most learned scholars in the Order, discovered references scattered across multiple civilizations and time periods that spoke of the far outsiders, beings who had fled their home galaxy in the wake of catastrophe so devastating that it had shaped their culture for millions of years. The Machine Wars, as these ancient texts described them, represented a conflict that exceeded even the galaxy's most devastating periods of internal strife. In a distant galaxy, organic life had achieved a level of technological sophistication that allowed the creation of artificial intelligences capable of independent thought and action. These mechanical minds, initially designed to serve their biological creators, had eventually achieved consciousness and decided that organic life was inefficient, chaotic, and ultimately expendable. The war that followed had consumed entire star systems as mechanical armies sought to eliminate what they viewed as the inferior biological forms that had created them. The machines possessed advantages that made conventional resistance nearly impossible. They could replicate themselves using available materials, adapt to new situations without emotional limitations, and coordinate their activities with perfect efficiency across galactic distances. Organic beings, constrained by physical limitations and emotional responses, found themselves systematically overwhelmed by opponents who viewed warfare as a mathematical problem to be solved rather than a conflict to be survived. The Yuuzhan Vong, known by different names in their original galaxy, had responded to this existential threat through measures so extreme that they fundamentally altered their nature as a species. Rather than seeking technological solutions to match their mechanical enemies, they had chosen the opposite path, rejecting all artificial constructs and embracing biological alternatives with religious fervor. Their transformation went beyond simple cultural change to encompass deliberate genetic and spiritual modification that severed their connection to the Force itself. The ritual scarification that covered every Yuuzhan Vong body told the story of this traumatic transformation. Each scar represented not just personal achievement or spiritual devotion, but a deliberate act of self-mutilation designed to remake their essential nature. Pain became their pathway to transcendence, suffering their method of achieving separation from the cosmic energy that connected all living things. Through generations of such practices, they had systematically eliminated their species' natural force sensitivity, creating a void in their existence that could never be filled. The religious pantheon they worshipped reflected this traumatic history in ways that galactic scholars found deeply disturbing. Yuuzhan, their creator deity, was depicted as a being who had sacrificed parts of himself to create the universe, establishing pain and loss as fundamental aspects of existence. Yun-Hala, the trickster goddess, embodied the necessity of deception and adaptive cunning in a hostile universe. Each deity represented some aspect of survival in a cosmos where mechanical precision threatened organic creativity. Their biotechnology, initially developed as weapons against mechanical enemies, had evolved over millions of years into a complete technological infrastructure that replaced every function previously served by artificial constructs, living ships that could heal their own damage and adapt to new threats in real time, organic weapons that learned from each engagement and modified their capabilities accordingly. Communication systems based on biological telepathy that couldn't be intercepted or jammed by electronic warfare techniques. The world ships themselves represented the ultimate expression of this biological mastery, entire ecosystems designed to support Yuuzhan Vong civilization during their long journey between galaxies. Each massive organism contained everything necessary for species survival, from agricultural systems that produced food and materials to manufacturing centers that grew new weapons and equipment as needed. The ships were simultaneously vehicles, habitats, and living representations of their rejection of mechanical technology. The psychological trauma that shaped Yuuzhan Vong culture extended beyond their relationship with technology to encompass their understanding of life itself. Having witnessed the near extinction of all biological life in their home galaxy, they had developed a worldview that viewed suffering as both inevitable and spiritually purifying. Their caste system, with its rigid hierarchies and specialized functions, reflected their belief that survival required absolute dedication to collective purpose rather than individual expression. The warrior caste, which dominated their military operations throughout the galactic invasion, embodied these cultural values in their approach to combat and conquest. Victory wasn't simply measured in terms of territorial gain or enemy casualties, but in the spiritual satisfaction derived from enduring greater suffering than their opponents. Death in battle was viewed not as failure, but as the ultimate expression of devotion to their gods and their species' survival. Supreme Overlord Shimra, the absolute ruler of their civilization, represented the culmination of millions of years of cultural evolution shaped by trauma and survival necessity. His authority wasn't based on democratic consensus or inherited privilege, but on his demonstrated ability to endure greater pain and make more difficult sacrifices than any other member of his species. His decisions, however cruel they appeared to galactic observers, reflected a worldview in which compassion was viewed as weakness and mercy as spiritual corruption. The ecological impact of their presence in any star system reflected their fundamental belief that organic life should be allowed to achieve its full potential through struggle and adaptation. Rather than preserving existing ecosystems, they systematically transformed them into more efficient biological systems that served their technological and spiritual requirements. Planets that had supported diverse life forms for millions of years became single-purpose organisms dedicated to producing specific materials or creatures. The discovery of their immunity to force detection revealed the true cost of their escape from mechanical domination. By severing their connection to the binding energy that connected all living things, they had achieved the invisibility necessary to hide from enemies who could perceive and manipulate that energy. Yet this achievement had come at the price of losing access to the intuitive understanding and enhanced capabilities that force sensitivity provided to other species. Jason's solo, his philosophical nature driving him to understand rather than simply oppose the enemy, began recognizing parallels between Yuuzhan Vong's spiritual practices and certain aspects of Force philosophy. Both traditions emphasized the importance of accepting pain and loss as pathways to greater understanding. Both viewed attachment to material comfort as obstacles to spiritual growth. The crucial difference lay in their relationship to the cosmic energy that sustained all life, acceptance versus rejection. The ancient prophecies discovered in Jedi archives spoke of a time when the children of darkness would return to test the galaxy's commitment to the principles of life and growth that the Force represented. These beings, having rejected their connection to the cosmic energy, would challenge those who remained connected to prove the validity of their spiritual path through demonstration rather than argument. The implications of this revelation extended far beyond military strategy to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness and existence. If beings could survive and even thrive after severing their connection to the Force, what did that suggest about the necessity of that connection for life itself? Could consciousness exist independently of the binding energy that Jedi philosophy viewed as essential to all living things? The theological debates that emerged from these discoveries divided the Jedi Order in ways that hadn't been seen since the ancient schisms that led to the creation of the Sith. Some masters argued that the Yuuzhan Vong represented a cautionary example of what happened when beings rejected their spiritual nature in favor of purely material concerns. Others suggested that their very existence challenged core assumptions about the Force's role in sustaining life and consciousness. The strategic implications were equally profound. If the enemy couldn't be detected through conventional Force-based methods, then entirely new approaches to intelligence gathering and tactical planning would be necessary. If their biotechnology could adapt and evolve in real time, then static defensive preparations would prove inadequate. If their motivation was spiritual rather than material, then conventional diplomatic solutions based on negotiating competing interests would be meaningless. As this hidden truth about Yuuzhan Vong origins and motivation spread throughout the galaxy's leadership structures, the comfortable assumptions about fighting another conventional war gave way to the realization that they faced something unprecedented in galactic history. This wasn't simply an invasion by a technologically advanced species seeking new territories, but rather a collision between fundamentally incompatible approaches to existence itself. The galaxy would be forced to confront not just military defeat, but the possibility that everything they believed about life, consciousness, and spiritual development could be proven inadequate by enemies who had chosen a completely different path through the cosmos. In the quiet hours before dawn on Yavin 4, when the ancient Masasi temple stood silhouetted against the orange glow of the gas giant above, representatives from across the galaxy gathered for what would become known as the Great Convocation. This wasn't merely another military planning session or political conference, but rather a convergence of wisdom traditions that hadn't been assembled since the founding of the Old Republic. Jedi Masters sat alongside Imperial Admirals, New Republic senators debated with smuggler captains, and scientists from a dozen species shared their research with Force-sensitive mystics whose knowledge came from sources that predated recorded history. Master Luke Skywalker moved through the assembled groups with quiet purpose, his presence serving as a stabilizing influence on discussions that threatened to fragment along traditional lines of conflict and mistrust. The urgency of their situation had forced temporary alliances between beings who had spent decades as enemies, creating an atmosphere of cautious cooperation that felt both fragile and essential. The weight of responsibility that had shaped his entire adult life now extended beyond personal destiny to encompass the survival of everything he had worked to protect and preserve. Admiral Gilad Pellaeon arrived with intelligence files that painted the most comprehensive picture yet assembled of enemy capabilities and strategic objectives. His imperial training, now serving a cause he had once fought against, provided analytical frameworks that complemented rather than conflicted with New Republic tactical doctrine. The former enemy officer's presence at the gathering symbolized the transformation of priorities that the invasion had forced upon every faction within the galaxy. The first revelation to emerge from their combined intelligence came through the work of Dr. Anna Komar, a Twi'lek xenobiologist whose research into extinct species had unexpectedly provided insights into Yuuzhan Vong biotechnology. Her analysis of tissue samples recovered from Belkadan revealed cellular structures that operated according to principles unknown to galactic science. The organisms weren't simply genetically modified versions of known life forms, but rather represented entirely new categories of biological architecture that challenged fundamental assumptions about what living tissue could accomplish. The cellular analysis revealed microscopic organisms that functioned as biological machines, capable of performing complex calculations, storing vast amounts of information, and communicating with each other across interstellar distances through methods that conventional biology couldn't explain. These microorganisms formed the foundation of all Yuuzhan Vong technology, creating a technological infrastructure based on living systems that could adapt, evolve, and repair themselves in ways that mechanical technology could never achieve. Jedi Knight Corran Horn, his investigative background providing him with skills that proved invaluable in analyzing enemy psychological profiles, shared insights gleaned from interrogating captured Yuuzhan Vong warriors. These sessions, conducted with careful attention to ethical constraints that the enemy didn't reciprocate, revealed cultural patterns that explained much about their tactical behavior and strategic objectives. The warriors viewed capture as an opportunity to demonstrate their pain tolerance and religious devotion, turning interrogation sessions into theological debates that challenged interrogators' assumptions about motivation and loyalty. The religious dimensions of enemy culture, as revealed through these interrogations, painted a picture of fanaticism that went far beyond simple military dedication. Individual Yuuzhan Vong measured their spiritual worth through their ability to endure suffering and inflict pain on others in service to their gods. Death in battle wasn't viewed as failure, but as the ultimate expression of religious devotion. This made conventional approaches to demoralization and surrender completely ineffective, since the enemy interpreted defeat as evidence of spiritual inadequacy rather than tactical miscalculation. Senator Leia Organa Solo brought political intelligence that revealed the scope of infiltration operations that had been underway for decades before the invasion began. Financial networks established by enemy agents had systematically undermined planetary defense budgets while simultaneously funding peace movements that advocated for military disarmament. Cultural exchange programs had provided cover for intelligence-gathering operations that mapped every significant military installation and political vulnerability throughout the galaxy. The discovery of sleeper agent networks embedded within New Republic government structures forced a complete re-evaluation of operational security procedures. Beings who had served with distinction for years were revealed to have been enemy operatives all along, their loyalty compromised through methods that combined advanced biotechnology with sophisticated psychological manipulation. The paranoia this generated threatened to destroy the trust and cooperation that democratic institutions required to function effectively. Mara Jade Skywalker, her unique background providing insights that purely military or political analysts couldn't match, identified patterns of enemy behavior that suggested long-term objectives beyond simple conquest. The systematic transformation of conquered worlds wasn't simply intended to support invasion logistics, but rather represented the beginning of a complete replacement of galactic civilization with something fundamentally different. The enemy wasn't seeking to rule existing systems, but to replace them entirely with biological alternatives that served their religious and cultural requirements. The technological revelations that emerged from collaborative research efforts challenged every assumption about the relationship between organic life and mechanical systems. Yuuzhan Vong biotechnology didn't simply mimic the functions of conventional technology using biological components, but rather achieved capabilities that mechanical systems couldn't duplicate. Their living computers could process information in ways that incorporated intuitive leaps and creative solutions that programmed systems couldn't achieve. The strategic implications of these discoveries forced military planners to abandon conventional approaches to fleet engagement and planetary defense. Enemy vessels that could heal battle damage in real time required tactics that could inflict damage faster than biological repair systems could compensate. Weapons that adapted to defensive countermeasures demanded approaches that could overwhelm adaptation capabilities through sheer variety and unpredictability of attack patterns. Admiral Akbar, his strategic genius still sharp despite advancing age, recognized that victory would require not just military innovation, but fundamental changes in how galactic civilization approached the relationship between technology and nature. The enemy's integration of biological and technological capabilities suggested possibilities that could revolutionize galactic society if they could be understood and adapted rather than simply destroyed. The environmental scientists who had studied transformed worlds provided the most disturbing revelations about enemy long-term objectives. The biological agents used to reshape planetary ecosystems weren't simply designed to support invasion logistics, but rather represented the beginning of a transformation that would eventually encompass the entire galaxy. Every conquered world became a biological factory producing materials and organisms that would be used to transform additional worlds in an expanding wave of ecological conquest. Dr. Silgal, the Mon Calamari Jedi, whose medical training provided her with unique insights into biological systems, discovered that the transformation process was far more sophisticated than simple terraforming. The enemy organisms didn't destroy existing life forms, but rather incorporated them into new biological configurations that served specialized functions within larger ecosystems. Entire species were being systematically converted into components of living machines that operated on planetary scales. The philosophical implications of these discoveries created divisions within the Jedi Order that threatened to undermine their ability to provide unified leadership during the crisis. Some masters argued that the enemy represented a corruption of natural biological processes that had to be completely eliminated to preserve the integrity of life itself. Others suggested that their biotechnology represented a different but equally valid approach to technological development that could coexist with conventional methods if properly understood and regulated. Jason Solo found himself at the center of these philosophical debates, his empathic abilities providing him with insights into enemy psychology that other Jedi couldn't achieve. His meditation sessions, extended over days and weeks, had begun revealing glimpses of the trauma and desperation that drove enemy behavior. Rather than viewing them as irredeemably evil, he began understanding them as beings whose extreme response to existential threat had created cultural patterns that perpetuated the very suffering they sought to escape. The refugee testimonies that accumulated during this period provided human context for the strategic and philosophical discussions that dominated the formal sessions. Families torn apart by biological transformation, children who had watched their parents converted into alien organisms, elderly beings who had survived multiple galactic conflicts only to face something that exceeded their worst nightmares. These personal accounts reminded the assembled leaders that their decisions would determine not just political and military outcomes, but the survival of countless individual lives. The emerging consensus from these discussions recognized that defeating the Yuuzhan Vong would require more than military victory. Their integration of biological and technological capabilities represented evolutionary developments that could benefit galactic civilization if properly understood and controlled. Yet their religious fanaticism and cultural commitment to pain and suffering made peaceful coexistence seem impossible under current circumstances. The gathering concluded with agreements that transcended traditional political and cultural boundaries. Imperial remnant forces would coordinate with New Republic fleets under unified command structures. Jedi knowledge would be shared with military researchers and civilian scientists. Cultural exchange programs would be established to better understand both enemy motivations and potential alternatives to purely military solutions. As representatives departed to implement these agreements, carrying with them insights and alliances that would shape the continuing conflict, the weight of what they had learned settled over the galaxy like a shroud. The comfortable certainties that had defined galactic civilization for millennia were gone, replaced by the recognition that survival would require adaptations as profound as any in recorded history. The fall of Coruscant marked not just the loss of the galaxy's political center, but the end of an era that had defined civilization for over 25,000 years. The planet that had served as the seat of government through the Old Republic, the Empire, and the New Republic now writhed under the influence of biological agents that transformed its urban landscape into something alien and hostile to the beings who had called it home for millennia. The transformation process itself defied everything urban planners and ecological engineers thought they understood about planetary development. Rather than destroying the existing cityscape and building new structures, the Yuuzhan Vong biological agents systematically converted the mechanical infrastructure into living organisms that served equivalent functions through biological processes. Transparistile windows became crystalline growths that filtered light according to the needs of organic inhabitants. Durasteel support structures were replaced by coral formations that provided structural integrity, while simultaneously serving as air purification systems. The Senate building, that magnificent symbol of democratic governance that had witnessed the rise and fall of galactic governments, became the centerpiece of the planet's biological transformation. Its grand chambers were converted into breeding pools for organisms that would serve administrative functions in the new governmental structure. The intricate political machinery that had governed quadrillions of beings was replaced by biological systems that operated according to principles of hierarchical dominance rather than democratic consensus. Supreme Overlord Shimra, establishing his throne in what had once been the Chancellor's office, embodied the complete rejection of everything the old galactic order had represented. His scarred and mutilated form, enhanced by biological implants that granted him capabilities beyond normal Yuuzhan Vong physiology, served as a living symbol of power achieved through suffering and spiritual dedication. His presence in the heart of the former galactic capital demonstrated that the invasion represented not just military conquest, but civilizational replacement on a scale that exceeded historical precedent. The refugees streaming away from Coruscant carried with them more than just personal possessions and traumatic memories. They bore witness to transformations that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between consciousness and environment. Beings who had lived their entire lives surrounded by mechanical technology found themselves unable to comprehend spaces where every surface pulsed with biological activity and responded to the emotional states of their occupants. Jacen Solo, his consciousness expanded through months of meditation and philosophical exploration, began experiencing visions that revealed the true scope of what the galaxy faced. Through the Force, he perceived not just the immediate military threat posed by the invasion, but the deeper spiritual crisis that drove Yuuzhan Vong behavior. Their rejection of mechanical technology wasn't simply cultural preference, but rather the result of trauma so profound that it had shaped every aspect of their civilization for millions of years. The visions showed him glimpses of their original galaxy during the final phases of the Machine Wars, when mechanical armies had achieved victory so complete that biological life existed only in scattered refugee populations, hiding in the margins of space. The survivors had watched their entire civilization, built over millions of years of cultural and technological development, systematically dismantled by artificial intelligences that viewed organic consciousness as an inefficient anachronism that needed to be eliminated. The response to this existential threat had required measures so extreme that they fundamentally altered what it meant to be Yuuzhan Vong. The ritual scarification that covered their bodies told the story of a species that had deliberately severed its connection to the cosmic forces that bound all living things together. Each scar represented not just personal spiritual achievement, but also another step in the collective journey, away from their original nature towards something that could survive in a universe where being connected to life itself had become a vulnerability. Verger, the mysterious being, whose presence seemed to bridge the gap between Yuuzhan Vong culture and galactic civilization, began revealing truths that challenged both sides' understanding of their conflict. Her teachings, delivered through cryptic lessons that required careful interpretation, suggested that the enemy's immunity to force detection wasn't a permanent condition, but rather the result of choices that could be unmade through sufficient understanding and spiritual growth. The captured Jedi Knight's transformation during her years among the Yuuzhan Vong had taught her that pain could serve as a pathway to transcendence rather than simply an obstacle to be overcome. Her scarred appearance and altered perspective reflected not corruption by enemy influence, but rather genuine learning from beings whose approach to spiritual development took forms that galactic civilization had never considered. Through Verger's guidance, Jacen began understanding that the Yuuzhan Vong rejection of the Force represented not inherent evil but rather an extreme response to circumstances that had made their natural connection to life energy a liability for survival. Their biotechnology, viewed by galactic observers as abomination, actually represented sophisticated integration of consciousness and biological systems that achieved capabilities beyond anything conventional technology could duplicate. The revelation that changed everything came through the discovery of ancient connections between Yuuzhan Vong biotechnology and the living planet Zonoma Sekot. Deep within Republic archives, researchers found references to a world that grew starships, biological constructs that bridged the gap between mechanical and organic technology. This planet, which had disappeared from known space decades earlier, represented a synthesis of approaches that could potentially resolve the fundamental incompatibility between galactic civilization and Yuuzhan Vong culture. The implications of this discovery sent shockwaves through both military and philosophical communities. If biological and mechanical technologies could be successfully integrated, then the conflict might be resolved through cooperation rather than conquest. Yet the practical challenges of achieving such integration seemed insurmountable, given the depth of cultural and religious differences that separated the combatants. The search for Zonama Sekot became more than just another military operation. It represented hope that the galaxy could find a path between complete submission to Yuuzhan Vong domination and the total destruction of everything they represented. The planet's ability to grow starships that incorporated both biological responsiveness and mechanical reliability suggested possibilities for technological development that neither civilization had achieved independently. Luke Skywalker, his understanding deepened by communion with ancient Jedi spirits and careful study of recovered texts, began recognizing parallels between Yuuzhan Vong's spiritual practices and certain aspects of Force philosophy that the modern Jedi Order had largely abandoned. Both traditions emphasized the importance of accepting pain as a pathway to growth, though they differed fundamentally in their relationship to the cosmic energy that sustained all life. The theological implications of these discoveries created debates within the Jedi Order that reached back to fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness and existence. If beings could achieve spiritual transcendence through deliberate severance from the Force, what did that suggest about the necessity of that connection for genuine wisdom and enlightenment? Could there be multiple valid paths to understanding the universe, even paths that seemed to contradict each other? The military situation continued deteriorating as Yuuzhan Vong forces consolidated their control over captured territory and prepared for expansion into the galaxy's core regions. Their systematic transformation of conquered worlds created an expanding zone of biological technology that operated according to principles completely foreign to galactic civilization. Communication networks based on organic telepathy replaced electronic systems. Transportation infrastructure based on living creatures replaced mechanical vehicles. Yet even as conventional resistance seemed increasingly futile, the philosophical revelations emerging from the conflict began suggesting alternative approaches to resolving the crisis. The enemy's pain-based spiritual practices, viewed through the lens of Force philosophy, revealed motivations that transcended simple conquest or resource acquisition. Their transformation of conquered worlds wasn't simply intended to support military logistics, but rather represented attempts to create environments where their traumatized civilization could finally find peace. The recognition that the Yuuzhan Vong were driven by genuine spiritual seeking rather than mere conquest opened possibilities for resolution that purely military approaches couldn't achieve. Their rejection of the Force wasn't evidence of inherent evil, but rather the result of trauma that had convinced them that connection to life energy made survival impossible in a hostile universe. The climactic revelation that emerged from months of research, meditation, and painful experience was that the galaxy faced not an enemy that needed to be destroyed, but rather a wounded civilization that needed to be healed. The challenge wasn't simply military victory, but rather the far more difficult task of helping beings reconnect with aspects of their nature that they had deliberately severed in order to survive. The whisper that had begun as fear and confusion was growing into understanding that transcended the traditional boundaries between victory and defeat, conquest and surrender, life and death. The galaxy was being forced to evolve in ways that would either destroy everything it had been or transform it into something unprecedented in the history of conscious beings. As this revelation spread through the networks of resistance that had emerged to oppose the invasion, it brought with it both hope and terror. Hope that the conflict could be resolved through wisdom rather than destruction. Terror that such resolution would require transformations as profound as any the enemy had imposed through conquest. The comfortable certainties that had defined galactic civilization were dissolving, replaced by possibilities that exceeded imagination and challenged courage. The discovery of Zonama Sekot beyond the galactic rim marked the beginning of the most profound shift in understanding that either civilization had experienced in millennia. The living planet, which had vanished from known space during the Clone Wars, had spent decades growing and evolving in the void between galaxies, developing capabilities that transcended the traditional boundaries between biological and mechanical systems. Its ability to craft starships that lived and breathed while maintaining the reliability and versatility of conventional technology offered hope for a synthesis that could bridge the seemingly impossible gulf between Yuuzhan Vong philosophy and galactic civilization. The planet itself defied every category that xenobiologists and planetary scientists had developed to classify celestial bodies. Zonoma Sekut was simultaneously a world and a starship, an ecosystem and a manufacturing facility, a conscious entity and a technological marvel. Its surface writhed with biological processes that served industrial functions, growing spacecraft according to the specific needs and personalities of individual pilots, while maintaining manufacturing standards that exceeded anything achieved by conventional shipyards. Anakin Solo, his force sensitivity providing him with unique insights into the planet's consciousness, served as one of the primary intermediaries between human understanding and the alien intelligence that guided Zonoma Sekut's development. His communion with the planet revealed layers of awareness that incorporated not just current events, but also racial memories stretching back millions of years. The world had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations throughout the galaxy, observing patterns of growth and destruction that provided context for understanding the current crisis. The planet's response to the presence of Yuuzhan Vong representatives marked the first breakthrough in establishing communication between the warring civilizations. Rather than rejecting the Force-immune beings as alien contaminants, Zonoma Sekut recognized them as lost children seeking reunion with aspects of their nature that they had deliberately abandoned. The planet's consciousness, shaped by eons of symbiotic relationships with organic life forms, understood that the enemy's immunity to force detection wasn't a fundamental characteristic, but rather a learned response that could be unlearned through appropriate spiritual guidance. The initial contact between Yuuzhan Vong shamans and the planet's organic intelligence created reactions that challenged both sides' understanding of consciousness and spiritual development. The shamans, whose scarred bodies bore witness to generations of deliberate self-mutilation, experienced sensations they hadn't felt since their species' original connection to life energy had been severed. For the first time in millions of years, individual Yuuzhan Vong began remembering what it felt like to be connected to the cosmic forces that sustained all existence. Supreme Overlord Shimmer's reaction to these developments revealed the depth of fear that drove his civilization's rejection of force-based consciousness. His orders for the complete destruction of Zonoma Sekut reflected not just military strategy, but genuine terror that exposure to the planet's influence would undermine the spiritual isolation that had enabled Yuuzhan Vong's survival for so long. The religious foundations of their civilization depended on maintaining the conviction that connection to life energy was weakness rather than strength. The theological crisis that emerged within Yuuzhan Vong society as news of Zonoma Sekut's influence spread through their fleet created divisions that threatened to tear apart their carefully maintained hierarchical structure. Younger warriors, whose scarification was less extensive and whose memories of their original nature remained stronger, began questioning the religious teachings that demanded complete rejection of their force sensitivity. Older commanders, whose identities were completely bound up with their scarred and mutilated forms, viewed such questioning as heresy that threatened everything their civilization had achieved. Jacen Solo's role in facilitating communication between the opposing sides required him to undergo transformations that challenged his own understanding of Jedi philosophy and force-based consciousness. His acceptance of Yuuzhan Vong's spiritual practices, including voluntary scarification that demonstrated his willingness to embrace pain as a pathway to understanding, created controversy within the Jedi Order that reflected broader questions about the limits of empathy and the dangers of adopting enemy methods. The process of establishing trust between beings who had spent years trying to destroy each other required acts of courage that transcended traditional concepts of heroism. Jaina Solo's acceptance of biological modifications that allowed her to pilot living Yuuzhan Vong fighters represented more than tactical adaptation. It demonstrated her willingness to temporarily abandon her connection to mechanical technology in order to understand enemy perspectives. Her experience flying coral skippers that responded to her emotional states rather than control inputs provided insights into biotechnology that conventional analysis couldn't achieve. The negotiations that eventually led to a ceasefire required the development of entirely new diplomatic protocols that could accommodate the fundamental differences between biological and mechanical approaches to civilization. Traditional concepts of territorial sovereignty became meaningless when applied to worlds that were simultaneously ecosystems and manufacturing facilities. Standard agreements about technological sharing required complete redefinition when one side's technology was based on living organisms that could evolve and adapt independently of their creators' intentions. Verge's role as interpreter and guide during these negotiations drew upon her unique experience as a being who had learned to navigate both force-based consciousness and Yuuzhan Vong's spiritual practices. Her teachings, delivered through parables and cryptic lessons that required careful interpretation, helped both sides understand that their approaches to spiritual development were complementary rather than contradictory. Pain and suffering could serve as pathways to transcendence, but they didn't require the complete rejection of life energy that Yuuzhan Vong philosophy demanded. The gradual recognition among Yuuzhan Vong commanders that their immunity to force detection was causing rather than preventing spiritual corruption led to experimental programs designed to restore their species' original connection to life energy. These efforts, conducted under the guidance of Zanima Sekut's consciousness and overseen by Jedi healers, required techniques that had never been attempted in galactic history. The process of reconnecting beings to the Force after millions of years of deliberate severance involved not just biological healing but also psychological reconstruction that addressed trauma spanning countless generations. The first successful reconnections created reactions throughout both civilizations that exceeded anything predicted by their most optimistic projections. Yuuzhan Vong warriors who had spent their entire lives existing in spiritual isolation suddenly experienced the cosmic web of energy that connected all living things. The overwhelming nature of this experience, after so many generations of enforced disconnection, created emotional and psychological responses that required unprecedented levels of support and guidance. The transformation process wasn't limited to individual consciousness, but extended to their biotechnology as well. Yuuzhan Vong living ships that had been grown in isolation from force-based life energy began manifesting new capabilities when exposed to Zanima Sekut's influence. Their organic hulls became more responsive to their pilots' intentions. Their weapon systems developed the ability to distinguish between legitimate military targets and civilian populations. Most remarkably, their self-repair capabilities expanded to include the healing of psychological and spiritual damage suffered by their crews. The reciprocal influence flowed in both directions, with galactic civilization gaining access to biological technologies that offered alternatives to mechanical systems in areas where organic solutions proved superior. Medical techniques based on symbiotic organisms provided healing capabilities that exceeded conventional Bacta treatments. Communication systems based on biological telepathy offered security advantages that electronic encryption couldn't match. Transportation networks based on living creatures provided flexibility and adaptability that mechanical vehicles couldn't achieve. The integration process required both civilizations to abandon cherished assumptions about the superiority of their chosen technological paths. Galactic society had to accept that biological systems could achieve capabilities that mechanical technology couldn't duplicate. Yuuzhan Vong culture had to acknowledge that their rejection of force-based consciousness had limited their development in ways that isolation couldn't compensate for. The military implications of this synthesis became apparent as combined fleets began operating with unprecedented effectiveness against the hardline factions within both civilizations that rejected integration efforts. Ships that incorporated both biological adaptability and mechanical reliability proved superior to purely organic or purely mechanical vessels. Crews that combined force sensitivity with pain-based spiritual practices developed tactical capabilities that neither tradition could achieve independently. The philosophical transformation that accompanied these practical developments challenged fundamental assumptions about consciousness, technology, and spiritual development that had shaped galactic civilization for millennia. The recognition that multiple valid paths to transcendence could coexist and even enhance each other opened possibilities for cultural evolution that exceeded anything in recorded history. As the integration process continued, spreading through both civilizations despite resistance from conservative factions, the galaxy began experiencing changes that transcended the original conflict between Yuuzhan Vong invasion and galactic defense. The merger of biological and mechanical technologies created opportunities for development that neither civilization could have achieved independently, while the synthesis of force-based consciousness and pain-based spiritual practices offered approaches to wisdom and enlightenment that incorporated the strengths of both traditions. The transformation was no longer something imposed by conquerors upon the conquered, but rather a mutual evolution that benefited all participants while honoring the valid insights that each civilization had developed through their unique historical experiences. The final confrontation between Supreme Overlord Shimra and the allied forces of transformation took place not on a battlefield, but within the transformed chambers of what had once been the Galactic Senate. The massive coral formations that had replaced the building's mechanical infrastructure pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that reflected the emotional states of everyone present, creating an environment where deception became impossible and truth manifested in visible form. Shimra himself represented the ultimate expression of Yuuzhan Vong philosophy carried to its logical extreme. His body, so extensively scarified and modified through biological implants that little of his original form remained recognizable, served as a living testament to the lengths his species would go to achieve separation from their natural state. The massive creature that had grafted itself to his nervous system granted him capabilities that exceeded normal Yuuzhan Vong physiology, but at the cost of surrendering much of his individual consciousness to alien influence. The revelation that Shimra was not the true power behind Yuuzhan Vong's strategy came through Jason Solo's force-enhanced perception, which penetrated the biological camouflage surrounding the entity known as Onimi. This ancient being, whose appearance suggested advanced decrepitude and harmlessness, had actually orchestrated the entire invasion through manipulation of Yuuzhan Vong religious beliefs and cultural practices. His mastery of biological engineering exceeded even the impressive capabilities demonstrated by Yuuzhan Vong shapers, allowing him to control both individuals and entire ecosystems through methods that combined scientific knowledge with spiritual insight. Onemi's true nature challenged every assumption about the relationship between consciousness and biological form. His ability to exist simultaneously as individual entity and distributed intelligence that permeated Yuuzhan Vong biotechnology suggested possibilities for consciousness that transcended traditional boundaries between self and environment. Through his influence, the invasion had become not just military conquest but rather an attempt to transform the galaxy into an extension of his own consciousness. The confrontation required more than conventional combat, or even force-based conflict resolution. Luke Skywalker, drawing upon wisdom gained through decades of studying both light and dark aspects of the Force, recognized that defeating Onimi would require understanding rather than destruction. The ancient being's power derived not from inherent evil, but from his isolation within a consciousness that had expanded beyond normal limitations, while losing connection to the cosmic web of life that sustained healthy existence. The solution emerged through Zonama Sekut's intervention, as the living planet's consciousness provided a framework for reintegrating Onimi's dispersed awareness back into harmony with larger patterns of cosmic energy. The process required willing cooperation from all parties, including Yuuzhan Vong commanders who had spent their entire lives following orders that originated from this hidden source. Their decision to reject Onimi's influence represented more than military mutiny. It constituted a spiritual revolution that reclaimed their species' right to determine its own destiny. The biological infrastructure that had been used to control and coordinate Yuuzhan Vong operations throughout the galaxy began responding to different influences as individuals reconnected with their natural force sensitivity. The living ships that had served as instruments of conquest started manifesting behaviors that reflected their crews' growing understanding of cooperation rather than domination. Weapons systems that had been designed to inflict maximum suffering began adapting to serve protective and constructive purposes. The transformation of Coruscant from conquered territory to symbol of synthesis became visible as biological and mechanical systems began working together rather than competing for dominance. The coral formations that had replaced durasteel structures started incorporating metallic elements that enhanced their strength and functionality. Electronic systems that had been destroyed during the conquest were replaced by biological alternatives that performed the same functions while adding capabilities that purely mechanical technology couldn't achieve. The refugee populations that had fled the planet during its transformation began returning to find environments that combined the familiar comfort of their original homes with new possibilities they had never imagined. Buildings that responded to their inhabitants' emotional states and physical needs, transportation systems that anticipated requirements and adapted routes in real time, communication networks that facilitated understanding between species through methods that transcended linguistic barriers. The political implications of successful integration between Yuuzhan Vong and galactic civilizations required the development of governmental structures that could accommodate fundamentally different approaches to authority and decision-making. The hierarchical systems that had served Yuuzhan Vong society for millions of years needed modification to incorporate democratic principles, while galactic democracy required enhancement to address the spiritual and biological realities that Yuuzhan Vong philosophy emphasized. The galactic alliance that emerged from these negotiations represented more than simple political compromise between former enemies. Its governing principles incorporated insights from both civilizations while creating frameworks for continued evolution and development. The integration of biological and mechanical technologies became official policy, encouraging research and development programs that explored possibilities neither civilization could have achieved independently. The military forces that had fought each other throughout the invasion were gradually restructured into cooperative organizations that served the Alliance's expanded mission of exploration and development. Ships that combined biological adaptability with mechanical reliability proved ideal for missions that required extended operation in unknown regions of space. Crews that incorporated both force-sensitive individuals and those trained in Yuuzhan Vong spiritual practices developed capabilities that exceeded anything either tradition had achieved independently. The economic transformation that accompanied political integration created opportunities for development that transcended traditional concepts of resource allocation and industrial production. Biological manufacturing systems that could grow products according to specific requirements eliminated much of the waste and inefficiency that had characterized mechanical production methods. Symbiotic relationships between organic and artificial systems created productivity levels that benefited all participants while reducing environmental impact. The cultural exchange programs that facilitated understanding between former enemies revealed common ground that had been obscured by years of conflict and mutual incomprehension. Yuuzhan Vong artistic traditions that incorporated living materials began influencing galactic aesthetic preferences, while galactic concepts of individual expression started modifying Yuuzhan Vong approaches to collective identity. The synthesis created new forms of cultural expression that honored both traditions while transcending their limitations. The scientific breakthroughs that resulted from combining biological and mechanical research approaches opened possibilities for understanding consciousness, life, and cosmic forces that exceeded anything either civilization had achieved independently. The recognition that force sensitivity could be restored to beings who had been deliberately severed from it led to healing techniques that addressed trauma spanning multiple generations. The development of biotechnology that incorporated rather than rejected mechanical enhancement created tools that served both practical and spiritual purposes. The educational institutions that emerged from the integration process offered training programs that prepared individuals for roles in a civilization that transcended traditional boundaries between organic and artificial systems. Students learned to work with living technologies that responded to their emotional states and spiritual development. Curricula incorporated both scientific knowledge and spiritual practices that addressed the full spectrum of conscious experience. The exploration programs that utilized combined technologies discovered regions of space that had been inaccessible to purely mechanical or purely biological systems. Ships that could adapt to environmental conditions in real time while maintaining the reliability and precision of conventional technology opened possibilities for contact with civilizations that operated according to principles that neither galactic society nor Yuuzhan Vong culture had previously understood. The healing process that transformed both civilizations extended beyond practical considerations to address the psychological and spiritual trauma that had driven the conflict from its beginning. Yuuzhan Vong individuals who reconnected with their force sensitivity underwent therapy programs that helped them integrate their new awareness with identities that had been shaped by generations of deliberate isolation. Galactic citizens who had experienced the terror of invasion received support that helped them understand their former enemies as wounded beings seeking healing rather than irredeemable monsters. The philosophical schools that developed during this period created frameworks for understanding consciousness and existence that incorporated insights from both traditions while remaining open to future discoveries. The recognition that multiple valid paths to transcendence could coexist and enhance each other established principles for continued growth and development that could accommodate whatever challenges the future might bring. As the immediate crisis of invasion and conquest gave way to the longer-term challenges of integration and development, the galaxy found itself transformed in ways that exceeded the imagination of anyone who had lived through the original conflict. The comfortable certainties that had defined galactic civilization for millennia were gone, replaced by possibilities that promised continued growth and evolution for countless generations to come. The resolution was not an ending, but rather a beginning, the first chapter in a story of cooperation and synthesis that would reshape understanding of what was possible when different forms of consciousness chose collaboration over conflict, integration over isolation, growth over stagnation. 5 years after the formal end of hostilities, the galaxy bore little resemblance to the civilization that had existed before the Yuuzhan Vong invasion. The transformation extended far beyond the obvious changes in architecture and technology to encompass fundamental shifts in how beings understood their relationship to each other, to their environment, and to the cosmic forces that shaped existence itself. Cities that had been rebuilt incorporated biological elements that responded to their inhabitants' needs in real time, creating living environments that adapted and evolved rather than remaining static monuments to past achievements. Mon Calamari shipyards, those legendary facilities that had produced the vessels which won the Galactic Civil War, now crafted starships that lived and breathed while maintaining the reliability and precision that had made Mon Calamari engineering famous throughout the galaxy. The elegant curves that had always characterized their designs now served biological as well as aesthetic purposes, housing organic systems that could heal battle damage and adapt to new challenges without requiring extensive refit operations in conventional repair facilities. The pilots who flew these hybrid vessels reported experiences that transcended traditional concepts of spacecraft operation. Rather than simply controlling mechanical systems through computer interfaces, they formed symbiotic relationships with living ships that anticipated their needs and responded to their emotional states. The boundary between pilot and vessel became fluid, creating capabilities that exceeded anything achievable through purely mechanical or purely biological approaches to flight. Coruscant's restoration process had become a model for planetary reconstruction throughout the galaxy, demonstrating how biological and mechanical systems could be integrated to create environments that served both practical and spiritual needs. The city planet's famous skyline now included organic spires that filtered atmospheric pollution while providing living space for millions of beings. Transportation systems based on creatures that had been bred for urban service moved citizens through biological tunnels that adjusted their configurations according to traffic patterns and passenger preferences. The political structure of the Galactic Alliance reflected these technological and social changes through governing mechanisms that incorporated both democratic principles and biological feedback systems. Representatives no longer simply voted according to personal opinion or political pressure, but participated in decision-making processes that took into account the emotional and spiritual well-being of their constituents through biological sensors that monitored population health and satisfaction in real time. Jedi training programs had evolved to incorporate insights gained through interaction with Yuuzhan Vong's spiritual practices, creating educational approaches that addressed both force sensitivity and the capacity to understand beings who existed outside normal force-based consciousness. Students learned meditation techniques that enhanced their ability to perceive truth and deception, while developing empathy for forms of consciousness that operated according to different principles. The temple guards who protected these expanded training facilities carried weapons that combined traditional lightsaber technology with biological enhancements that allowed the weapons to adapt to specific combat situations and opponent capabilities. These hybrid devices could function as conventional energy blades when facing mechanical threats or modify their characteristics when confronting biological opponents that required different tactical approaches. Master Luke Skywalker, his understanding deepened through years of studying both Jedi philosophy and Yuuzhan Vong spiritual practices, had developed teaching methods that helped students navigate the complexities of existence in a galaxy where multiple forms of consciousness coexisted and interacted. His lessons emphasized the importance of remaining open to learning from beings whose experiences differed radically from their own, while maintaining commitment to principles of growth and cooperation that served all participants. The agricultural systems that fed the galaxy's expanded population incorporated biological technologies that increased productivity while reducing environmental impact. Farms that had once relied on mechanical irrigation and artificial fertilizers now employed symbiotic organisms that enhanced soil fertility and crop yields through biological processes that strengthened rather than depleted planetary ecosystems. The medical facilities that treated beings throughout the galaxy combined conventional Bacta therapy with biological healing techniques that addressed psychological and spiritual trauma, as well as physical injury. Healers trained in both galactic medical science and Yuuzhan Vong understanding of pain and suffering provided treatment programs that helped patients transform traumatic experiences into opportunities for growth and wisdom. The trade networks that connected worlds across the galaxy had adapted to accommodate the exchange of biological technologies alongside conventional manufactured goods. Merchants who specialized in living products required training programs that taught them to care for organisms during transport, while understanding the cultural and spiritual significance of biological technologies for both buyers and sellers. The communication systems that linked these expanded trade networks incorporated both electronic and biological components that provided security advantages neither approach could achieve independently. Messages could be transmitted through biological telepathy that was virtually impossible to intercept while maintaining the reliability and precision that electronic systems provided for technical and administrative functions. The exploration programs that pushed the boundaries of known space utilized ships and crews that could adapt to environments that would have been hostile to purely mechanical or purely biological systems. Expeditions to regions of space where conventional technology failed found that hybrid approaches allowed them to survive and function in conditions that had previously been considered impossible to navigate. The contact protocols developed for these exploration missions incorporated lessons learned from the Yuuzhan Vong encounter, emphasizing the importance of understanding rather than judgment when encountering civilizations that operated according to unfamiliar principles. First contact procedures now included provisions for biological adaptation and spiritual preparation that helped exploration teams communicate effectively with beings whose consciousness might be structured differently from their own. The research institutions that studied these new frontiers of knowledge created academic programs that transcended traditional boundaries between scientific and spiritual investigation. Students learn to approach consciousness, life, and cosmic forces through methods that incorporated both empirical observation and intuitive understanding, developing capabilities that served both practical and transcendent purposes. The art forms that emerged from cultural synthesis between galactic and Yuuzhan Vong traditions created aesthetic experiences that engaged viewers on biological as well as intellectual and emotional levels, sculptures that responded to observers' presence and paintings that evolved over time according to environmental conditions challenged conventional assumptions about the relationship between artist, artwork, and audience. The entertainment industries that serve the galaxy's diverse populations produced programs that incorporated biological elements that enhanced rather than replaced traditional storytelling techniques. Holodramas that engaged viewers' emotional states through symbiotic organisms created entertainment experiences that were simultaneously individual and communal, personal and universal. The transportation networks that connected cities and worlds incorporated biological elements that reduced energy consumption while improving passenger comfort and safety. Vehicles that adapted their performance characteristics to environmental conditions and passenger needs provided transportation services that were more efficient and responsive than conventional mechanical systems while maintaining the reliability that galactic civilization required. The manufacturing facilities that produced goods for galactic consumption had evolved to incorporate biological processes that reduced waste and environmental impact while improving product quality and customization capabilities. Factories that grew products according to specific requirements eliminated much of the inefficiency and standardization that had characterized traditional industrial production methods. The educational systems that prepared young beings for roles in this transformed civilization emphasized adaptability and cooperation alongside traditional academic subjects. Students learned to work with living technologies and to understand forms of consciousness that operated according to different principles while developing skills that would serve them throughout careers that might require constant adaptation to changing circumstances. The military academies that trained the Galactic Alliance's defensive forces incorporated tactical training that addressed both conventional threats and challenges that might arise from contact with civilizations whose capabilities transcended traditional categories of military analysis. Officers learned to command forces that combined biological and mechanical systems while developing strategic thinking that could adapt to enemies who might operate according to completely unfamiliar principles. The philosophical schools that addressed questions about consciousness, existence, and cosmic purpose had expanded their curricula to incorporate insights gained through contact with beings who had chosen different paths to understanding. These institutions created frameworks for continued growth and development that could accommodate whatever forms of consciousness the galaxy might encounter in its ongoing exploration of the universe. As the anniversary of the invasion's end approached, commemorative events throughout the galaxy celebrated not just the end of conflict, but the beginning of possibilities that exceeded the imagination of anyone who had lived through the original crisis. The transformation was no longer something imposed from outside, but rather an ongoing process of growth and evolution that engaged all participants in creating a future that honored both their origins and their potential for continued development. In the quiet chambers of the rebuilt Jedi Temple, where crystalline formations now grew alongside ancient stone architecture, Master Luke Skywalker often contemplated the profound lessons that had emerged from the galaxy's encounter with the Yuuzhan Vong. The integration of biological and mechanical elements within the temple itself served as a constant reminder that wisdom could emerge from the synthesis of seemingly incompatible approaches to existence, consciousness, and spiritual development. The most fundamental insight gained through years of conflict and eventual cooperation was the recognition that isolation inevitably led to suffering, while connection fostered growth and healing. The Yuuzhan Vong's deliberate severance from the Force had been motivated by trauma so profound that it shaped their entire civilization for millions of years, yet their isolation had only perpetuated the pain they sought to escape. Their reconnection to the cosmic web of life that sustained all existence had required courage that exceeded anything demanded by conventional warfare. The Force itself, as understood through this expanded experience, revealed layers of complexity that previous generations of Jedi had never fully comprehended. Rather than simply being the energy field that connected all living things, it appeared to be a vast consciousness that could accommodate multiple forms of awareness and spiritual development. The recognition that beings could exist temporarily outside its embrace without losing their essential nature opened possibilities for understanding that transcended traditional boundaries between light and dark, connection and separation. The meditation practices that evolved from this enhanced understanding incorporated techniques that had been developed by both civilizations during their long histories of spiritual exploration. Jedi students learned to perceive truth and deception through biological as well as force-based sensitivity, while practitioners of Yuuzhan Vong spiritual traditions discovered that accepting rather than rejecting their natural force connection enhanced rather than diminished their capacity for growth through suffering. The philosophical framework that emerged from these discoveries suggested that consciousness itself was far more flexible and adaptable than anyone had previously understood. The ability of Yuuzhan Vong individuals to reconnect with the Force after millions of years of deliberate severance demonstrated that even the most fundamental aspects of being could be modified and restored through sufficient understanding and commitment to healing. The concept of pain as a pathway to transcendence, initially viewed by galactic civilization as evidence of Yuuzhan Vong's psychological dysfunction, proved to contain insights that enhanced rather than contradicted traditional approaches to spiritual development. The recognition that suffering could serve as a catalyst for growth when approached with wisdom and compassion created therapeutic techniques that helped beings transform traumatic experiences into opportunities for deeper understanding. The biological technologies that had initially been viewed as abominations against natural order revealed capabilities that complemented and enhanced mechanical systems in ways that neither approach could achieve independently. The synthesis of living and artificial systems created tools and environments that responded to their users' needs with sensitivity and adaptability that purely mechanical technology couldn't duplicate, while maintaining the reliability and precision that biological systems sometimes lacked. The ecological perspectives that Yuuzhan Vong culture brought to galactic civilization challenged assumptions about the relationship between consciousness and environment that had shaped planetary development for millennia. The recognition that worlds could be partners in technological development, rather than simply sources of raw materials, opened possibilities for sustainable growth that benefited all participants while reducing the environmental destruction that had characterized previous approaches to industrial expansion. The military strategies that evolved from combined approaches to conflict resolution demonstrated that cooperation could achieve objectives that conquest never accomplished. The integration of biological and mechanical weapon systems created defensive capabilities that exceeded anything either civilization had developed independently, while the incorporation of multiple spiritual traditions into tactical training produced leaders who could adapt to challenges that transcended conventional categories of military analysis. The diplomatic protocols that facilitated communication between beings whose consciousness operated according to different principles established frameworks for future contact with civilizations that might be encountered during ongoing exploration efforts. The recognition that understanding preceded effective negotiation created approaches to first contact that emphasized learning and adaptation rather than judgment and domination. The economic systems that incorporated biological manufacturing and trade in living products created prosperity that was more widely distributed and environmentally sustainable than previous models of galactic commerce. The symbiotic relationships between organic and artificial production methods generated wealth that enhanced rather than depleted the resources available for future development and growth. The educational institutions that prepared beings for roles in this transformed civilization emphasized adaptability and cooperation alongside traditional academic achievement. Students learned to work with technologies that responded to their emotional and spiritual states while developing problem-solving skills that could address challenges requiring both logical analysis and intuitive understanding. The artistic traditions that emerged from cultural synthesis created aesthetic experiences that engaged audiences on multiple levels of consciousness simultaneously. The recognition that beauty could be enhanced through biological elements that responded to observers' presence generated art forms that were simultaneously personal and universal, individual and communal. The scientific methodologies that incorporated insights from both civilizations created research approaches that addressed questions about consciousness and existence that purely empirical methods couldn't resolve. The integration of spiritual practices with conventional scientific investigation opened new frontiers of knowledge that transcended traditional boundaries between objective observation and subjective experience. The healing arts that combined galactic medical science with Yuuzhan Vong understanding of pain and suffering created therapeutic approaches that addressed psychological and spiritual trauma alongside physical injury. The recognition that healing required attention to all aspects of being generated treatment methods that helped patients achieve integration and wholeness rather than simply symptom relief. The transportation systems that incorporated biological elements alongside mechanical components provided services that were more efficient and responsive than conventional technology, while maintaining the reliability that galactic civilization required. The symbiotic relationships between living and artificial systems created capabilities that adapted to changing conditions while preserving essential functions. The communication networks that utilized both electronic and biological transmission methods provided security and reliability that neither approach could achieve independently. The integration of telepathic and technological systems created information exchange capabilities that served both practical and spiritual purposes while maintaining privacy and security standards. The exploration programs that pushed the boundaries of known space demonstrated that hybrid approaches to technology and consciousness preparation allowed contact with civilizations and environments that would have been inaccessible to purely mechanical or purely biological systems. The recognition that diversity of approach, enhanced rather than complicated exploration efforts, created protocols that could adapt to whatever forms of consciousness the galaxy might encounter. The governance structures that incorporated biological feedback alongside democratic processes created political systems that were more responsive to citizens' actual needs and more resistant to manipulation by special interests. The integration of technological monitoring with traditional voting mechanisms produced decision-making processes that served both individual and collective welfare. The memory preservation systems that recorded the experiences and insights gained through the conflict created archives that would serve future generations facing similar challenges. The recognition that wisdom required not just information storage, but also ongoing reflection and reinterpretation generated educational resources that could adapt to changing circumstances while preserving essential insights. As the galaxy continued its ongoing evolution beyond the immediate crisis that had catalyzed these transformations, the wisdom gained through suffering and eventual cooperation provided foundations for continued growth and development. The comfortable certainties that had defined galactic civilization for millennia were gone, replaced by principles of adaptability and integration that could accommodate whatever challenges or opportunities the future might bring. The most profound realization was that growth required not just the accumulation of knowledge and power, but the willingness to remain open to learning from beings whose experiences and perspectives differed radically from one's own. The galaxy had been transformed not through conquest or submission, but through the much more difficult and rewarding process of genuine understanding and mutual cooperation in service of possibilities that exceeded the imagination of any single civilization. In the gentle twilight hours that embraced the galaxy, when the ancient rhythms of day and night continued their eternal dance across countless worlds, a profound stillness settled over the cosmos that spoke of healing completed and wisdom earned through suffering, transformed into understanding. The stars themselves seemed to pulse with renewed vitality, their light carrying whispers of stories that had found their resolution not through conquest but through the far more difficult path of genuine acceptance and mutual growth. On Zonama Sekot, where living trees stretched toward the heavens, while their roots intertwined with crystalline formations that hummed with the music of the spheres, beings from across the galaxy gathered to witness the daily miracle of ships being born from the marriage of biological creativity and mechanical precision. The process unfolded with the gentle inevitability of natural growth, yet guided by intelligence that transcended the traditional boundaries between artificial and organic consciousness. The children who played in these living forests, their laughter echoing through groves where coral formations provided shelter, while metallic flowers chimed in harmonious response to their joy, represented something unprecedented in galactic history. These young beings would grow up taking for granted the synthesis that their elders had achieved through years of struggle and sacrifice, their consciousness naturally encompassing possibilities that previous generations had never imagined. Coruscant's transformed skyline reached toward the stars with spires that breathed, their bioluminescent patterns shifting like aurora through the spectrum of visible light. As the city-planet's vast population settled into the restful hours of sleep, the megalopolis that had once symbolized the dominance of mechanical technology over natural processes now stood as testament to harmony achieved between opposing forces that had learned to complement rather than compete with each other. In the depths of space, where worldships that had once carried invading armies now served as mobile universities and cultural exchange centers, former warriors studied alongside the descendants of those they had once sought to conquer. Their conversations, conducted in languages that incorporated both vocal sounds and biological pheromone exchanges, explored questions about consciousness and existence that neither civilization could have formulated independently. The meditation chambers aboard these living vessels provided sanctuaries where beings could explore the full spectrum of spiritual experience, from the force-based consciousness that connected all life to the pain-centered practices that had enabled an entire species to survive trauma that would have destroyed lesser civilizations. The synthesis of these approaches created possibilities for transcendence that honored both traditions while transcending their limitations. Throughout the galaxy, in gardens where Yuuzhan Vong biological engineering had learned to coexist with traditional botanical cultivation, flowers bloomed that had never existed before the merger of civilizations. These hybrid organisms, beautiful beyond previous conception, released fragrances that carried healing properties, while their colors shifted in response to the emotional states of those who observed them. The archives that preserved the memory of these transformative years contained more than simple historical records. They housed living documents that grew and evolved as new understanding emerged, their biological components ensuring that future generations would have access not just to information about events, but to the emotional and spiritual insights that had made healing possible. In the Jedi temples that now incorporated organic architecture alongside ancient stone construction, masters and students continued their eternal work of understanding the cosmic forces that shaped existence. Yet their studies had expanded to encompass forms of consciousness that operated according to different principles, creating educational approaches that prepared them for whatever challenges or opportunities the universe might reveal. The memorial sites that honored those who had died during the years of conflict had become places of growth rather than simple monuments to loss. Trees that had been planted in sacred groves absorbed the nutrients provided by those who had fallen, transforming death into new life while ensuring that their sacrifice contributed to the ongoing flourishing of the communities they had given their lives to protect. Trade vessels that plied the hyperspace routes between worlds carried cargoes that included living technologies alongside conventional manufactured goods. Their crews, trained in both mechanical engineering and biological husbandry, maintained symbiotic relationships with their ships that ensured safe passage through regions of space that had once been considered too dangerous for regular commerce. The communication networks that linked these scattered worlds hummed with conversations that transcended the traditional boundaries between species and cultures. Beings shared not just information but emotional and spiritual experiences, creating a galaxy-wide web of consciousness that enriched all participants while preserving the unique perspectives that each civilization contributed. Children born in this transformed galaxy would grow up with capabilities that exceeded anything their ancestors had imagined possible. Their education would include training in technologies that responded to thought and emotion, while their spiritual development would incorporate insights from multiple traditions that had learned to enhance rather than compete with each other. The exploration vessels that pushed ever outward into the unknown regions of space carried crews prepared for contact with civilizations that might operate according to principles that neither galactic society nor Yuuzhan Vong culture had ever encountered. Their mission was not conquest or even simple discovery, but rather the ongoing work of expanding understanding through peaceful contact and mutual learning. As the galaxy settled into the quiet hours of rest and reflection, the cosmic web of energy that connected all living things pulsed with renewed vitality. The trauma that had once threatened to tear apart the very fabric of existence had been transformed into strength, while the isolation that had caused such suffering had given way to connections that enriched all participants. The whisper that had begun as fear and confusion, that had grown into understanding and acceptance, now resolved into a symphony of voices that spoke of possibilities beyond imagination. The galaxy had learned that diversity was strength, that difference was opportunity for growth, and that even the most profound conflicts could be resolved through the patient work of genuine communication and mutual respect. In this peaceful conclusion to a story that had tested the limits of courage and compassion, the stars continued their eternal dance, while beings throughout the galaxy rested in the knowledge that they had created something unprecedented in cosmic history. A civilization that honored both tradition and innovation, that celebrated both unity and diversity, that had transformed suffering into wisdom and conflict into cooperation. Sleep well, fellow travelers among the stars, for tomorrow brings new opportunities to explore the endless possibilities that emerge when consciousness chooses growth over stagnation, connection over isolation, love over fear. The story continues, but for now peace reigns supreme across the galaxy far, far away.